It was one of the largest and bloodiest battles humanity had ever seen up to that point. A titanic clash that slammed the door on an entire generation of brutal warfare, brought the career of Napoleon Bonaparte to a sudden final halt, and opened the way to nearly a century of relative peace in Europe. This was the Battle of Waterloo. For more than 2 decades, Europe had not known a single day without the sound of guns. The French had overthrown and executed their king, fought off wave after wave of foreign armies sent to turn back the revolution, and then crossed their own borders, carrying the Republican flame to set neighboring lands ablaze. In the middle of this storm of blood and fire, one man rose up and took hold of France's destiny. A military genius who swept enemies from the battlefield as easily as he brushed aside political rivals in the corridors of power. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. By 1812, he had set the crown on his own head, swallowed up vast territories in northern Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, and Germany. He built a web of puppet governments stretching across the continent, forcing Prussia, Russia, and Austria all to bow before him. But the same limitless ambition that had lifted him so high was about to become his downfall. In the far west, his attempt to subdue Spain and Portugal ran into ferocious resistance, a grinding guerrilla war with no clear end, devouring army after army and bleeding France's treasury dry. In the east, his great gamble of 1812, the invasion of Russia, ended in catastrophe. His once mighty Grande Armée disintegrated in the blizzards of the Russian winter. Napoleon still wore the imperial crown, but the power beneath it had been eaten away to the root. 2 years later, a broad coalition of Europe's great powers poured into French territory. They forced Napoleon to abdicate and sent him into exile on the tiny island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. For a moment, it seemed the war was finally over. In Vienna, Europe's leading statesmen gathered to redraw the map. They danced at glittering balls, dined at lavish banquets, and haggled over borders and kingdoms across polished tables. But all of it, in the end, proved only temporary. In the spring of 1815, the exiled emperor of the French slipped out of his captor's reach and with a small band of loyal followers landed on the southern shores of France. The old boldness was still there, the same fierce decisiveness, the same magnetic presence that few could resist. Napoleon marched straight for Paris. As he advanced, units of the royal army began to switch sides. Soldiers abandoned the legitimate king and drifted back into the orbit of their former emperor. Napoleon entered the capital as the king fled in haste. Across Europe, a shiver ran down every spine. Napoleon was back on the throne. The response was swift. The great powers assembled a new coalition army, vowing to strike France from every direction. Hundreds of thousands of troops from Russia, Spain, Portugal, Austria, the German states, the Netherlands, and Britain were called up once more and prepared to march. Napoleon knew that if he sat still, he would be crushed. So he chose to move first. His plan was simple and ruthless. Smash one wing of the coalition, plant fear and division in the enemy's ranks, and hope the rest would hesitate. The most logical target was the Allied army stationed in what is now Belgium, a region that had not long before been part of France. Napoleon believed many soldiers there might still feel sympathy for him and have little stomach for fighting their former emperor. He was openly contemptuous of the British. In his eyes, their troops were second-rate, and although the Duke of Wellington had beaten French marshals in the Peninsular War, Napoleon was certain that face-to-face with him, this British general would be outmatched. In June 1815, Napoleon led his army north. On the 15th, he crossed the frontier, driving a wedge between the British Allied forces around Brussels and the Prussian army near Namur, like ramming a steel spike between two wooden beams. While Allied commanders were still scrambling to adjust, Napoleon struck first at the Prussians. At Ligny, the French drove them from the field, the opening victory of the campaign, and as it turned out, its last. At Quatre Bras, British forces managed to block another French thrust. But as the Prussians began to pull back, Wellington had no choice. He ordered a retreat as well, rather than risk being cut off and destroyed in detail. Under a torrent of rain, the Allied columns trudged north along roads turned to deep mud. Wellington guided them to a defensive ridge not far from Brussels. The last line he chose to make a stand against Napoleon. Just beyond that slope, hidden from view, lay a small village with an unassuming name, Waterloo. And from that moment on, history would remember the battle by that name. The night before, the battle was brutal. Canvas tents, torn and worn, couldn't keep out the rain. Cold water seeped into every corner where men tried to sleep. Thousands of boots and hooves churned the ground until the fields became a black, sucking sea of mud. That night, we were up to our knees in filth and stinking water, one British soldier later recalled. There was nothing to be done but lie there in the muck. Men and horses shook with cold. But by the morning of June 18th, the clouds were breaking. The storm had passed. Napoleon seized the moment. His plan was clear and brutal. Launch an all-out assault, shatter the Anglo-Allied army before the Prussians could arrive, and then march straight on Brussels. Standing in his way was Wellington's mixed, mostly untested army, around 67,000 men, fewer than half of them British. The rest were Dutch, Belgian, and German troops from smaller states. Wellington himself had once bitterly remarked that he was commanding the worst army ever to march under heaven. Clumsily assembled at the last minute, poorly equipped and far from ideal. Across the field, by contrast, stood Napoleon's hardened veterans, men who had followed him through campaign after campaign. To offset his weakness in troop quality, Wellington turned to ground and fortification as his allies. He transformed 3 large farm complexes into forward strongpoints, Hougoumont anchoring his right, La Haye-Sainte guarding the center, and Papelotte holding the distant left. Napoleon, with superior numbers at his back, planned to open with a storm of artillery fire, then roll forward with waves of infantry and cavalry, sweeping the Allied line from the ridge. The rain-soaked fields slowed his guns, but Napoleon brushed aside every concern. He dismissed Wellington as a mediocre commander and boasted that this battle would be no more than a morning's work. The first French blow fell on Hougoumont, a feint meant to drag Wellington's attention toward the right, while the real killing stroke would be aimed at the center. Around 11:30 a.m., 80 French guns roared to life. An eyewitness said their combined fire sounded like a volcano erupting as iron shots smashed into the Allied lines, tearing gaps through the formations. French infantry surged across the fields, but immediately ran into a wall of lead. Allied riflemen, hidden behind stone walls, fired through small loopholes they'd carved out the night before, turning the farm into a fortress. What had begun as a diversion quickly became a nightmare for the French. Napoleon, fixated on capturing Hougoumont, kept throwing more men into the grinder, feeding the farmstead with blood and bodies. A little after 1 in the afternoon, he opened a second major attack on the other side of the field. Dense French columns moved forward, crushing the crops underfoot as they climbed steadily toward Wellington's ridge. Eagles fluttered above them, the bands played. Voices rang out in unison, "Vive l'Empereur!" They descended into the valley, then began the hard climb up the muddy slope. Wheat nearly as tall as a man brushed their faces. Thick mud clung to their boots, turning each step into a struggle. As they neared the top, the fighting closed to frighteningly short range, so close that soldiers could see the eyes of the enemy across the smoke. Muskets were only deadly within a few dozen yards, and in many places, men crashed into each other with bayonets, fists, and the butts of their guns. The Allied line began to bend, but just as the line seemed ready to break, Wellington made a move that changed everything. Amid choking smoke and the roar of battle, he issued a single, daring order, one so unexpected that even the oldest veterans were stunned. And from that moment on, Waterloo was no longer just a clash of armies, but a fight for the fate of an entire continent. What happened next? And how could one command turn the tide of war? Find out in the next chapter of the story.